Hello, and welcome to Revolutionary Ideas, the Marxist podcast from Socialist Alternative. With Donald Trump in office in the US and Farage's reform on the rise in Britain, many are looking for answers about how we can fight the racist right. Why is the far right on the rise now? Is this a new fascist movement we're facing? And if so, how do we fight it? To answer these questions and more, today we have our regular host, Connor, interviewing Bill Hopwood, who is a member of International Socialist Alternative's section in Canada. Before I pass over to those two, I just want to plug a couple of things. The new issue of ISA's political journal, International Marxism, is out now. Issue 2 includes essential articles on topics like how can the Palestinians win liberation, the need for a new international anti-war movement, and the spread of wars across Africa. We also have a brand new book, which we've recently published. Lenin's classic, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, has just been reissued by Socialist Alternative, with a fresh introduction on the relevance of Lenin's ideas for socialists and anti-war fighters today. To get the journal and the new book, go to socialistalternative.info/shop. With that out of the way, over to Connor and Bill.
Today we're going to be talking about fascism. Fascism is, I think, quite a relevant topic for us to be talking about at the moment, given that we're seeing this kind of rise globally of the far right. And I think that maybe the best place for us to start would be to talk a bit about what's behind that, what's going on right now. Why is the far right on the rise?
Okay, sure. I think it's useful to look at the rise of the right from the point of view of the working class and from the point of view of the capitalist class, because there are different reasons and different motives. If we take the working class, first of all, workers around the world are angry. They've faced stagnant wages as the bosses take more and more of the profits. Public services are being cut and have been cut almost everywhere to pay for the tax cuts for the rich and for big corporations. So I know in Britain the health service is grossly underfunded, and here in Canada the wait lists for operations get longer and longer, and that's a similar pattern in other countries around the world. Public housing doesn't really exist. I know in Britain it's called council housing. Nobody builds council houses or social housing or public housing, or whatever name you want to call it these days. And then you had, the last few years, you had soaring inflation, meaning everything was getting more expensive. And even there, the statistics sort of massage out rent or house food, and it's like core inflation, ignoring food. Like, okay, how do we get by with ignoring food? So, millions and millions of working class people are angry, looking for answers. And unfortunately, in general, there are no answers from what I could call the mainstream left. So society is polarizing and people are looking for answers. Unfortunately, in most countries, it is the right, the populist right, that is making most of the running. They seem to have answers. But I do think it's important to make the point that if there is a viable left, it gets a huge response. Take the case in Britain at the moment. There was a demo of 100,000 around the far right in London, and yet I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong, 700,000 people have expressed interest in joining Corbyn and Sultana's new party. So there's more people interested in the left than in the right. It's just the left far too often is absent or ineffective. So that's why the working class is looking for answers, and the right populists seem to be the ones who have answers.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's definitely true right now. And you're really, I think, seeing this kind of political situation that we've had for decades, the kind of neoliberal era, coming to an end and being replaced by this new period of crisis, of political polarization, of increased global conflict and so on, and the ruling class in trying to address the crises that their systems run under, the sort of the running out of road that neoliberalism had. They've had to turn to other ways to maintain their rule, right? They've had to double down on a lot of the sort of reactionary pillars of their system, of the family, of the nation, and so on. And I think that we've seen this shift to the right in general, but it's been these parties that represent that more explicitly that have been able to sort of, at this stage anyway, I would say, reap the rewards of the anger that exists at the system by saying, well, it's these issues of things like migration or trans rights and so on that are the problem in society.
I mean, the point of view of the ruling class is not the same as the working class. The capitalist class is not angry at lousy wages. They are making more profit than they've ever made in their probably in the history of capitalism. The inequality in society is probably greater than certainly any time since the 1920s or going back to before the First World War. But yeah, so the capitalist class had to change. And maybe it's useful just explaining briefly what was going on. You know, in the era of globalization and neoliberalism, there was all this talk of the nation state is going to disappear. And you had these free trade agreements. They weren't completely free trade, but it did lower tariffs and other restrictions. And that was driven not out of philanthropy or, oh, let's have an international free world. That's where the profits were. And the key to that was the rise of Chinese capitalism. China, after the crushing of the working class in Tiananmen Square, and it wasn't just in Tiananmen Square, it was in factories and workplaces all across China. There was this mass movement that the Chinese regime crushed. They then decided, yes, we're going to move towards capitalism. And this was enormously attractive to the capitalist class of the older capitalist countries, the imperialist capitalist countries. China provided a source for cheap labor, but also skilled labor and disciplined labor. And also China had an infrastructure to move the things from the ports and so on. So for a time, China offered this great new market for capitalism. They could sell raw materials, they could sell machine tools, they could sell luxury goods to China. The Chinese capitalist class were getting rich, and the ruling class of the West were having the advantage of cheap commodities, which could mask the falling living standards in real wages of workers in the United States, Britain, Europe, and so on. But increasingly, China became a rival. The Chinese capitalists were eating up markets around the world, but also they were moving from cheap consumer goods to high tech, to aircraft, to machine tools, to computers, clean energy, now things like AI. So the market that China provided to the West was increasingly being eaten up by the Chinese themselves. And they're, in fact, threatening, for instance, in Europe, I gather a huge chunk of the electric vehicle market is now taken by Chinese electric vehicles. This was supposed to be the savior of the auto industry. So increasingly, China becomes a rival. And you have to shift from globalization, neoliberalism, to economic nationalism, to the nation state, the government intervening very directly into the economy, building up trade barriers. And all of this predates Trump. This is not a Trump thing. But to justify this, they have to have an ideology. So they come up with these reactionary ideas of the nation state, of nationalism. And that implies with it anti-immigrant, racism, and then they throw in a whole bunch of anti-trans and queer, so it's a return to these reactionary ideas. And they recognize the working class is angry. They have no intention of raising wages. They have no intention of funding the health service or building public housing. But there's a scapegoat. Blame that other. And that is a feature of almost every reactionary regime in history, is you try to other a section of society and turn the anger onto them. So the ruling classes turn to the far right is not because they're angry. It's how do we keep control of society so we can keep on making super profits? How can we line up the masses behind this reactionary program? And it's in the absence of the left putting an alternative that these ideas get an echo. But I think we have to stress again and again that if the working class has a political program to answer these points, it can cut across the rise of the right.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's all really important. And actually, when we talk about fascism, obviously we often talk about that in the context of World War II, Mussolini in Italy, Hitler in Germany, and so on. And actually, in the period running up to World War II, and of course the war itself, this kind of heightened inter-imperialist conflict was actually a huge part of the situation then as well. Running up to World War II, and of course the war itself, this kind of heightened inter-imperialist conflict was actually a huge part of the situation then as well. And that also saw this turn towards nationalism, turn to the right of the capitalist class. And that was one of the things that obviously provided the backdrop for the fascist movements. But of course, fascist is a term that's used really loosely by a lot of people in politics. There's pretty much, I would say, no politician that hasn't by someone at some point been described as fascist, whether that's really accurate or not. As Marxists, we try and be more scientific about how we understand phenomena in society, how we understand political developments. And so we try not to just kind of use these terms based on vibes. we try and get to the core of what these things actually represent. And so what do you think fascism means? How should we define fascism?
I guess the short answer is a reactionary movement where the capitalist class mobilize the middle layers of society. Marx would call them the petty bourgeois. And just to be clear, what we don't mean, people today talk about the middle class when basically what they mean is skilled workers. The petty bourgeois are people who own their own business but aren't big capitalists, like a shopkeeper, a small farmer, self-employed. Those layers, and they were used to be a much bigger share of society than they are today. And also, the absolutely demoralized. Marx would use the term lumpen proletariat. We probably wouldn't use that term today, but the utterly demoralized sections of society, criminal gangs, and so on, those mass forces are mobilized by the capitalist class to crush the working class. Not just to beat up the working class, literally to crush all the organizations of the working class, to annihilate the workers' organizations. And I think it's important to understand that specific thing. And you said about, Marxists using terms correctly. Well, if a doctor just said, well, I think it's the flu, it wouldn't be very useful as a diagnosis. And that's why we try to be precise. Yes, there are elements of Trump or Farage in Britain or Le Pen in France who clearly have elements of similar things to fascism, but they are not fascist. And it's important to have that clear diagnosis to say, what do we do? What is the political situation we face? And obviously we should explore that further.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very true. And that sort of idea of a mass movement that involved these kind of middle layers in society is exactly what we saw in examples like Italy, which is, of course, where the term fascism comes from. You saw this 2 red years in Italy in 1919 of mass revolutionary movements of workers. There was a general strike in solidarity with Russia, factories occupied, land seized, and so on. And it was a movement that, my understanding is at the time, it was led by the socialists in Italy, but the leadership of that party wasn't revolutionary, even despite the sort of revolutionary aspirations of the workers. And so the movement wasn't carried through to its conclusion. But in this kind of context of the capitalists facing down this threat of revolutionary movements, they turned to the fascists, to Mussolini, who actually originally did come from Mussolini himself came from the Socialist Party originally, the pro-war wing of the socialists, and the fascist movement was built as, armed gangs and so on, as you said, in order to smash the trade unions and socialist organizations to make sure that they couldn't come to power or pose any threat to the capitalists, actually.
Like I said, that period, the interwar period, particularly in continental Europe, was a period of sharp class struggle, of polarization. The capitalist class were desperate. And in many countries, they turned to military dictatorships or strong men. In that case, at that time, it was almost all men. In Poland, Portugal, there was a revolution in Hungary in 1919, and the general who brutally crushed that, Horthy, then went on to rule Hungary as a military dictator. Similarly, Bulgaria, Latvia, and all the rest of it. All across continental Europe, there were various forms of either military dictators or just strong, brutal rulers who might have had a veneer of democracy. But in some countries, the working class was too powerful for that to happen successfully, or the capitalist class were too weak, or both. And that's where fascism comes in. And the first country, as you said, was Italy. You had that 2 red years, general strikes, workers were occupying the factories, mass upheaval. Probably one point I would to add is the Russian Revolution. We shouldn't discuss this period without the Russian Revolution. So you had in 1917 in Russia, the revolution, the working class takes power, and this has an electric effect across the world. Bearing in mind that World War I is still going on. People around the world are absolutely fed up of slaughter, of hunger, of shortages of food, are looking for answers. And when the war ends, and again, not written in very much in history, World War I ends, one, because of the Russian Revolution, and two, then in 1918 in November, the German sailors and then the soldiers mutiny. The German army no longer exists. The war ends because of working class action. So you have this wave of revolutions as workers are trying to find a way to emulate the Russian Revolution. Now, in most cases, the leadership of those movements was relatively inexperienced. You have to bear in mind the Bolsheviks had spent decades of struggle, of consolidation, of political clarification, of unification, lots of debates and lots of disagreements over those decades. But by 1917, you had this cohesive, clear, working class organization with roots in the factories all across Russia that could lead that revolution. In Italy, you had a socialist party. The majority of the members said, we want the Russian Revolution. A section of the leadership goes, I'm not so sure about that. And later on, in 22, I think, just before Mussolini comes to power, in 21, the Socialist Party votes to join the Communist International. And then the right wing decide to leave. So you have this turmoil in the Italian labor movement, and the revolutionary workers are still trying to build a party. See, this is a theme in continental Europe at that time. And initially, Mussolini's gangs were a joke. They got derisory votes in elections. They were seen as, just cranks. They're a bit like some of the people who stormed the Capitol at the end of Trump's first term in office. But increasingly, the capitalist class seeing this mass movement of working class people, because we need something to do with this, and we can't use the police. The police are not reliable. So they start funding the fascist gangs, and the fascist gangs get bigger. They become more violent. They attack working class organizations. In some cities, the workers' parties ran the government of the city, so the fascists beat up the mayor and sacked the city hall. Mussolini's organization grows. But even in the 1921 elections, they only got 7% of the vote. They weren't exactly popular. But what was key, and this is, again, we'll come back to this even more in Germany, is it's not what the population wanted, it's what the ruling class wanted. Mussolini met the Confederation of Italian Industry, CBI, I guess would be the equivalent in Britain. He met the American ambassador. And the American ambassador and the Italian industry heads say, go for it. And he is given power. He didn't seize power. There was no coup. The capitalist class say, here, you're in charge. Then, once Mussolini had control of the state apparatus, used that to smash the working class. But even initially, it wasn't that easy. Initially, the working class resisted. Mussolini rigged the elections, and he got 65% of the vote. But he didn't get a landslide, None of this 99.2%. There was enormous resistance. But over time, he consolidated his rule and became the fascist prototype of Italy. Fascism, by the way, means bundle of sticks, basically. And the idea was the sticks individually are weak, but if they're all bound together, they're stronger. And, Mussolini's narrative was nationalism, make Italy great again, I guess. I don't know how that one goes. Crushing the unions. Also expansionism. Mussolini, started invading, I think, parts of the Balkans, eventually invades Ethiopia, and so on. So yeah, imperialist, nationalist, reactionary ideas. In a sense, Germany is the archetype.
Yeah, right.
Italy was first, and it's the prototype, I guess.
Yeah.
And then, so again, in Germany, you have the mutinies, workers' councils in 1918, all over Germany. You had a Soviet in Bavaria. You had workers' council strikes, was defeated. And again, you have the working class divided. You have the traditional German Socialist Party, the SPD, and you have the beginnings of the Communist Party, initially led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, who were murdered in 1919. But over the next decade, the Communist Party becomes a mass party. The Socialist Party is still a mass party. So you have these two enormous working class parties. And again, Hitler initially is a joke, a clown. But over time, again, the German capitalist class decide we need to deal with these workers, because there was a revolutionary wave in 1919, another revolutionary wave in 1923. And by the mid-1930s, Hitler's party is eaten the lunch of the center parties. The center parties collapse. So you basically have a right-wing Hitler's party, and you have these two mass workers' parties. And increasingly, the capitalist class is fearful of another revolution is coming. And more are giving Hitler money. There's a famous photo montage by John Hartfield of Hitler doing his Heil Hitler salute, where Hitler says, there's millions behind me. And what it is the billionaires are putting money into Hitler's hand. So you have this mass polarization. And tragically, at that point, the communists had forgotten all the lessons from Italy. By 1934, under the Soviet Union, by this time, is dominated by Stalin, and we don't have time to deal with the rise of Stalinism, a tragedy for world history and the working class. And they have this crazy idea that anybody who isn't a communist is a fascist. So rather than appealing to the ranks of the German social democracy and say, together we have to stand to fight fascism. You're members of socialists, we're communists, okay? We disagree about things, but let's work together to stop what is coming. We can deal tomorrow, if we're still alive, with the debates between us. But if the fascists come to power, we're all dead. So let's stand together. But instead of doing that, the communists denounced the socialists as social fascists. In some cases, actually worked with the Nazis against the social democracy. And it's not like the German working class were not armed. Both the Socialist Party and the Communist Party had mass militias. The Reichsbanner had over 3 million members, 400,000 of them military trained. And they had weapons, and they didn't just have pitchforks and old muskets. They had machine guns, and in some cases they had tanks. And the Communist Red Front, I'm not going to say it in German, my German isn't good enough, Red Front fighters had over 150,000 members. You have these two armed working class organizations, but instead of them fighting together, they were at each other's throats, and the working class was divided. And the last free elections in Germany, interestingly enough, the Nazi vote went down and the socialist and communist vote went up. And at that point, the German capitalist class go, oh God, here comes revolution number 4. The German capitalist class, oh my God, here comes another revolution. Now we have to act. And they did exactly the same in Italy. They gave Hitler power. Hitler never seized power. He didn't do any coup or anything. The German capitalist class said, right, you do it. And he took power and he rigged the elections and all the rest of it. But even still, after the triumph of Hitler, the German working class didn't vote Nazi. This is after Hitler's come to power. He's massacring communists and socialists. He's smashing unions up. Hitler got 43% of the vote. And the Socialist and Communist Party got 30% of the vote, although they were in fact illegal. And one of the big myths of German capitalism is this collective guilt, that the German people are guilty of fascism. They are not. The vast majority of the German working class did not support Hitler. The capitalist class are guilty of fascism, and to hide their guilt, they try to blame the German people. And I think, again, that's, important to understand, is that fascism is a conscious decision of the capitalist class to hand power to these forces in order to crush the working class.
I think that that's really important because, there is this myth that the German people supported Hitler as a whole, but actually the communists and the socialists had millions of supporters, of voters and members, but it wasn't through a sort of lack of courage from those working people to fight fascism that Hitler came to power. It was, as you said, completely a failure of leadership of those organizations, and it was that huge contradiction that Trotsky talked about, where the country with the most powerful workers' movement in history saw fascism come to power and crush it with essentially not a shot fired, without a struggle, with barely a whimper. I think that's a really important point.
And I think one other important point is the capitalist class of the rest of the world didn't go, oh my God, this is terrible. The German workers are crushed. Democracy has ended in Germany. They go for it. Just to give a few examples. The United States was exporting steel and oil to Japan until 1941. Now, Japan was not fascist. It was a brutal military dictatorship. But by 1940, they'd signed various agreements and pacts with Italy and Germany, and the three of them were operating collectively together. One historian wrote that the sailors in Pearl Harbor were probably killed by US steel that was exported to Japan and then turned into weapons. I'm not going to refer to Canada very much, but just a little bit. If you ever have a chance to read our former prime minister, not our prime minister, the country's former prime minister, Mackenzie King, he visited Hitler. And he writes in his diary the most sycophantic, disgusting, creepy entries about how wonderful Hitler is. And there was a boatload of Jewish refugees came to Canada, and the Canadian government turned the boat back, and they all were sent back to Europe, and most of them died in concentration camps. And the Minister of Immigration in that government, when asked about Jewish immigration, said, none is too many. And Churchill was famous for loving Mussolini. And all of the Western governments was like, okay, Nazis, communists, go fight it out. Have a war on the Eastern Front and kill each other, and we'll pick up the pieces. Because it's still an imperialist rivalry. Britain, Germany, and France and the United States are economic rivals. So what became United States, Britain, allies would have loved to have Germany to have been destroyed and picked up the pieces, and they would have loved if at the same time the Soviet Union had been beaten up and capitalist economy would have been restored in the Soviet Union. So it's not like the Western democracies cared about democracy, and there were significant elements of the British establishment who seriously looked at fascism. I believe the king who abdicated was a noted fascist.
I think that's absolutely right. Ultimately, for the ruling class, they would prefer fascism, at the very least, to losing their privileges and power in society, right? And it's for that reason, why fascism actually benefited the bourgeois. They were able to, restrain workers' conditions. They were able to maintain private ownership of what we call the means of production and so on. And of course, there's loads of examples of, the imperialists' support for fascism. So obviously, this is all very important historical context, and I think it maybe is worth bringing this back to the present day. A lot of people have described some of the situations that we're seeing right now, Trumpism in the US, its equivalents in much of Europe and so on, as fascism. Based on what we've just been talking about, do you think that that's the best way to understand things like Trumpism?
I think Trump, like I said near the top about people angry, why some workers support Trump. Although, to be clear, the big support for Trump was not the working class. It was a section of the small businesses, better off sections of society. If you looked at the people who were charged after the Capitol, there weren't many workers in that list. And similarly, Farage's support, yes, he does get a section of the working class, but he also gets a significant section of the middle layers of society who are being squeezed and don't see any future. And certainly in Britain, he gets support of a bunch of people, people who want to go back to the empire, basically. And in a sense, that's what Trump's Make America Great Again is. It's a hearkening back to some alleged golden era. It was not a golden era for the working class in the United States before the Second World War, but that sort of idea. But I think to be clear, we have to be clear what fascism is. And I referred to Clara Zetkin. I want to give a plug for Clara Zetkin, German communist. She wrote an excellent document called The Struggle Against Fascism and Resolution on Fascism for the 1923 Communist International Conference. They are available online or in a short book published by Haymarket. And these are written a year after Mussolini comes to power, and yet she nails it spot on. And she makes the point that fascism, I've talked earlier about the reactionary regimes in Eastern Europe. And she specifically refers to Horthy, who crushed the Hungarian Revolution, who was, a monster. But she says he is not a fascist. Horthy used the military, and most of those regimes use the officer caste to crush the workers. But in the case of Italy, and then later in Germany, it's a mass movement of social forces. And she also makes the point that the rise of Mussolini is punishment because the work proletariat has not driven forward the revolution. And those same points are made by Trotsky in 1933-34. Trotsky talks about the historic function of fascism is to smash the working class, destroy its organizations. The workers' organizations are annihilated. The proletariat is reduced to an amorphous state. Now, Trump is a threat to the working class. Let's not kid ourselves. He's a threat to women, to trans people, to migrants, to blacks. But he is not yet, and probably will not, seek to turn the labor movement into an amorphous, annihilated swamp. And also the capitalist class doesn't see the need for fascism at this stage. And it's probably very difficult for people today to realize just how hated the fascists were across Europe, and in most cases the capitalist class. Because as the Nazis occupied France, for instance, Norway, and other countries, a sizable section of the capitalist class supported them. The regime in France cooperated fully with the extermination of the Jews. And Hitler coming to power meant whether you were a socialist or a communist, you were dead. The Jews were exterminated. Similarly for Roma, for queer people, mass extermination. But also afterwards, the capitalist class was hated across Europe because they collaborated. So you had mass social revolutionary waves. You had Eastern Europe became part of the planned economy. So the capitalist class paid a price. So they would prefer not to use that if they can get away with using a military dictatorship or strong men like Trump, who sort of increasingly he's almost ignores the democratic rules. He just does what he likes. And up till now, the Supreme Court has largely said, yeah, you can do what you like. And so the bourgeois norms that normally constrain politicians are increasingly being shredded, particularly by Trump, but you can see similar examples, Orban in Turkey, Hungary, Erdogan just arrests any politician who's an opposition politician who might beat him and just puts him in prison. Modi in India. Yeah, so you see these rise of these strong men. Marx describes them as Bonapartes, based on the two French dictators, Napoleon Bonaparte after the French Revolution, and then his nephew, I think.
God, yeah, something like that.
After the failure of another revolution in 1848. Yeah, so today there are these reactionary forces, and we've explained why the capitalist class have moved this way and why it gets a section of the working class. But at this stage, the capitalist class does not see the need to crush the working class. So what you have these extreme various right-wing parties, and almost all of them have a fascist wing. We shouldn't kid ourselves. The Proud Boys and there are other paramilitary militias all across the United States support Trump. In the Farage universe, there are open fascists.
I think actually a really pertinent example of that recently has been, at least at the time that we're recording this, we've seen a mass demonstration by supporters of Tommy Robinson in London. And although that is not a Farage demonstration, that's a demonstration that's much further to the right, that's based on gangs of people that have been organising to intimidate refugees, that have been showing up to harass left-wing meetings and so on. That does have an element of fascism in it, but I think that's another example. Farage isn't a fascist. I think he could well play this sort of strongman role if he comes to power. And here in Socialist Alternative, we're trying to fight the right and make sure that doesn't happen. But I think that you see in Britain, just as in a lot of places, that these kind of street movements and so on, these more fascist elements of the movement play a role as like an auxiliary to these strongmen, even when they're not in the party. And of course, in things like the Brothers of Italy in Italy, Marine Le Pen's movement in France, there are fascists within those movements and within those parties. They've often been right at the core of helping to build those parties. And of course, in Italy, Meloni's party directly descends from Mussolini's.
And Modi in India, the roots of Modi himself are in the RSS, which was founded, inspired by the Nazis, and still has fascist characters in the RSS, deeply Hindu chauvinist, anti-Muslim, anti-Christian, all that stuff. So yes, and I think the example of Chile in 1973 is a useful example. It was a military dictatorship. Pinochet crushed the Chilean working class. But there were fascist gangs. And they were used to cause trouble, to attack workers' organizations, to attack picket lines. And this is used to create the atmosphere of, there's disorder on the streets. We need strong government to put a halt to this. So the fascists were used as auxiliaries, as a paramilitary wing, but were not allowed to get their hands on the lever of power in Chile. That was for the ruling class, the military elite. The younger sons of the capitalists often end up as generals. So you have reactionary governments, and often they have a fascist wing that has a role in terms of trying to attack the workers' organizations or other scapegoats, migrants, trans people. But I think there's two other points just to wrap on. One also is the mainstream parties legitimize these parties. Starmer he made some speech which echoed Enoch Powell about immigrants. Macron in France has been aping Le Pen's anti-immigrant rhetoric. So the mainstream parties legitimize the far-right parties, and the far-right parties have a fascist wing. It is not like everything's fine. It's not like this is not a serious threat to the working class. And the working class needs to take these dangers seriously. And in a sense, it doesn't matter to an immigrant whether they're beat up by a fascist or a Farage supporter. It's the same. But what it does mean is under fascism, there is no democratic rights. Like the United States, our sister organization, Socialist Alternative, openly is out there campaigning. If the United States was fascist, Socialist Alternative would be an underground organization. Probably some people would have fled the country. So the capitalist class legitimize the far right, part of the nationalist rhetoric, and so on. But I think I want to finish, like the point that Clara Zetkin makes, is that fascism is the price the working class pays for a failed revolution. So Socialist Alternative in Britain is energetically building Corbyn's party, Sultana's party, because as I said before, they got 700,000 people interested. Tommy Robertson got 100,000. Yes, Tommy Robertson is dangerous and should be worried, but there's the potential to challenge Tommy Robertson and Farage if that party was built. So we are working very strenuously to make that party come into being, to offer a political alternative to the working class. But I think we also need to stress, we also want to build a force to carry out a revolution. Because we're saying right now that Trump is not a fascist. We're saying right now that Farage is not a fascist. But it's not ruled out that in 10, 20 years, the capitalist class may turn to fascism. You know, we can't rule that out. And the prospects for humanity, whether you're looking at the economy, and we haven't even talked about climate change, don't get me going, you know, is very grim. So the idea of building a revolutionary force is absolutely vital to tackle capitalism. Because capitalism, even if it's not fascist, is still pretty damn horrible. You know, wars around the world, mass poverty, cuts to public services, climate disasters. So we want to build a revolutionary force. If you like the ideas, join us.
Thanks to Connor and Bill for this episode of Revolutionary Ideas. If you agree with the Marxist ideas and analysis in this podcast, why don't you take the next step and join us? We're fighting for a fundamentally different kind of society, a socialist society. If you're interested, go to socialistalternative.info and click Get Involved. Also follow us on social media. On Instagram, we're socialistalternative.ews. On TikTok, go to socialist_vids. On X, we're socialistaltews. And on Facebook, you can find us at Socialist Alternative, ISA, England, Wales and Scotland. Thanks, and see you next time.